Today I am going to talk about one of the most macabre crimes ever recorded. The brutality committed in a luxury hotel in the heart of New York transformed a story of glamour into an irreversible nightmare. But as details emerged, shock gave way to doubt. After all, what really happened in that hotel room? Before understanding how the paths of Carlos and Renato crossed, and how this story culminated in one of the most shocking tragedies involving Portugal and the United States, it is worth getting to know the two central figures of this case. Let's start with Carlos. Carlos Antonio Castro was born on October 5, 1945 in Moçambique, in the former Portuguese province of Angola. He grew up in a large family. Carlos had 6 siblings and lived surrounded by extreme poverty, facing a childhood marked by mistreatment from his father and strong rejection from his own siblings for being homosexual. At age 15, he fled to Luanda and, after Angola's independence in 1975, moved to Lisbon with virtually nothing, even working as a drag queen in the capital's nightlife to survive. In Portugal, he built a very prominent career in entertainment journalism. Known as a social columnist, journalist, and writer, Carlos became one of the most popular figures in the Portuguese press, mainly due to his interviews with celebrities, his frequent presence on television, and his proximity to the artistic world. Off camera, he was remembered as someone outgoing and good-humored, but who also carried the emotional deficits of his childhood, becoming very possessive in his romantic relationships. Renato Seabra, on the other hand, was born on September 10, 1989 in Canton, Haiti, Portugal. Son of Joaquim Antonio Seabra and Odilia Pereirinha, he grew up in the city center alongside his mother and sisters. His parents separated during his childhood. His mother, Odilia, worked as a nurse at a local health center. She was the one who raised the children. Meanwhile, his father, Joaquim, went to live apart from the family in Vila Real de Santo Antonio in the Algarve, but continued to show support for his son even from afar. Renato was described by neighbors, teachers, and friends as a quiet, shy, religious, and reserved young man, very attached to his family, who liked to lead a simple life alongside his mother and sisters. During adolescence, he developed a great interest in sports, especially basketball. At age 12, he started playing for Canton Heat Basketball Club, where he even competed at a federation level. In his studies, he was considered an average student. He completed high school in Canton Heat and later enrolled at the Faculty of Sports Science and Physical Education at the University of Coimbra. When the crime happened, he was just one class away from completing his degree. During this period, Renato became interested in the modeling world and the possibility of building a career linked to his image. At age 21, he was trying to gain space as a model, and after signing with the Face Models agency, participated in the television show Looking for a Dream, seeking recognition in the artistic world. In October 2010, their paths crossed during a stay at the Sheraton Porto Hotel and Spa in the city of Porto. At that time, Renato was still trying to consolidate his career as a model, while Carlos already had a consolidated trajectory. Over time, beyond the personal relationship, the journalist also began to encourage and support the young model in his professional trajectory. From the first meeting, an immediate connection arose between them. Despite the significant age difference and the obvious physical differences, the relationship progressed rapidly thanks to the affinity they found in their interests, tastes, and life perspectives. Both in public and alone, they showed admiration and affection for each other. He also accompanied Carlos on several trips through Europe, visiting cities like Madrid and London. During a drag gala ball held in Lisbon in late 2010, Carlos drew the guests' attention by publicly revealing that he believed he had found his soulmate. On that occasion, the journalist also shared that the two planned to spend New Year's Eve in New York. The declaration attracted a lot of attention because Carlos was a well-known figure in Portugal and used to have his personal life followed by the press. On December 29th, the two arrived in New York to enjoy a few days of rest and celebration. They stayed in Suite 3416 of the Intercontinental Hotel, where they would remain during that stay in the city. During their stay in New York, Carlos and Renato took the opportunity to visit some of the city's most famous places. They went to Madison Square Garden to watch a basketball game, visited Rockefeller Center, walked down Fifth Avenue, and also watched famous Broadway shows. On New Year's Eve, Carlos and Renato were in the famous Times Square, where they watched the traditional celebration that gathers thousands of people every year. In early January 2011, Carlos and Renato left New York and headed to Atlantic City, New Jersey, where they would continue their trip. There, Carlos introduced Renato to Wanda Pires, a Portuguese journalist who lived in New Jersey, and her partner. The four enjoyed a pleasant evening together. The next day, they met again at a famous pizzeria in the city, where Renato continued to demonstrate affection and closeness to Carlos. At that moment, nothing seemed to indicate that the relationship between the two was about to take a completely different turn. At first glance, a mature man and a young model shared projects, dreams, and plans for the future. But behind this ideal image, troubling signs began to appear. Starting on January 5th, Carlos began to realize that something was wrong. Renato started waking up every morning with a distant and strange behavior. He seemed restless, irritated, and visibly uncomfortable. After several months marked by closeness and passion, the young model began to reject his partner both in public and in private, including starting to find the intimate act with Carlos disgusting. During this period, in addition to the change in behavior, his spending also increased considerably, leading him to constantly ask Carlos for money to spend in the city's casinos. Arguments began to arise over trivial reasons and transformed into constant confrontations. Eventually, they practically stopped speaking to each other. Carlos was deeply disappointed with Renato's behavior and began to think that his friends were right when they warned him that the young man might be with him only for self-interest. He began to realize that that whole relationship might have been just an illusion. After the trip to Atlantic City, they returned to the hotel in New York. That night, the journalist had the feeling that the story they had built together was coming to an end. After dinner, Carlos called his friend Vanda to vent. During the conversation, Carlos even said that he felt as if he were living with two completely different people, as he no longer recognized Renato in recent days. He also expressed that the relationship seemed to have come to an end, and that as soon as they returned to Lisbon, each would go their own way. On January 7th, a Friday, at 6:30 in the evening, the elevator doors opened in the lobby of the Intercontinental Hotel, and Renato appeared, walking in an uncontrolled manner. He seemed disoriented, dazed, and struggling to maintain his composure. That was when he crossed paths with Monica Pires, daughter of his friend Vanda Pires, who was at the hotel to visit the journalist. When she saw Renato in the lobby, Monica immediately realized something was wrong. Renato had an unkempt appearance, with messy clothes, a haggard face, looked exhausted, acting in a very strange way, with an expression that conveyed confusion and restlessness without showing despair, which caught her attention. She tried to talk to him to find out what was wrong, but received a disturbing response. Renato guaranteed that Carlos would never leave the room again. Renato's phrase put Monica on alert, and she decided to go up to the suite immediately to see what had happened to her friend. For more than 15 minutes, she tried to contact him without success. She knocked repeatedly on the door, but no one answered. Convinced that something serious had happened, she returned to the lobby and asked the hotel manager for help. Both returned to the room, and after several frustrated attempts to get a response, the manager decided to open the door using the master key. Upon entering the suite, they faced a devastating scene. The room was completely turned upside down, and Carlos was on the floor, naked and partially covered by a sheet. He had been the victim of an extremely violent attack. Shortly after, the suite was cordoned off by authorities. Forensic experts from the New York Police Department began a meticulous collection of evidence, gathering samples of blood, hair, and fibers found throughout the room. While investigators analyzed the crime scene, a tall, athletic young man hailed a taxi elsewhere in the city. Visibly nervous and restless, he asked to be taken immediately to a hospital. During the ride, he exhibited strange behavior that caught the driver's attention. At one point, he asked to turn on the radio because he needed to hear alleged hidden messages. The taxi driver also noticed that both of his wrists were bandaged and showed visible traces of blood. They arrived at the hospital around 10 p.m. The passenger quickly exited the vehicle and entered the emergency room, where he received medical attention. Moments later, the driver heard a special radio alert issued by the authorities. The New York Police Department was looking for a young foreigner whose physical characteristics perfectly matched those of the passenger he had just transported. Alarmed, he immediately contacted the taxi dispatch to report what happened. Less than 10 minutes later, SWAT officers surrounded the hospital and specialized detectives arrested the main suspect, who was calm, having received sedatives in the emergency room. At 11 p.m., the investigators who remained at the hotel received confirmation that the suspect was in police custody. Renato's arrest marked a new phase in the case. From that moment on, in addition to reconstructing the crime scene, investigators and experts attempted to understand the young man's mental state and what could have led to the crime. The medical examiner determined that Carlos Castro died from a combination of blunt force head trauma and neck compression. Carlos also suffered severe injuries that left him unrecognizable, including genital mutilation, a detail that would later become one of the most talked about points during the trial. Following his arrest, Renato underwent an extensive evaluation process involving forensic psychologists, psychiatrists, criminal experts, and lawyers. The main objective of these evaluations was to determine whether Renato understood the nature of his acts, or if his psychological problems had affected his ability to comprehend reality. Experts evaluated his childhood, personality, motivations, and various aspects of his personal life. The results of the evaluations revealed that Renato presented signs of psychological disorders, but also raised differing interpretations among experts regarding the impact of these conditions on his behavior. The experts concluded that he presented bipolar disorder and unspecified personality disorders. However, the true extent of these conditions and how much they influenced his actions remained one of the main points of debate. Lawyers from both sides were shocked when reviewing several recordings made during the evaluations. In them, Renato appeared behaving in an unusual manner, exercising without clothes, imitating superheroes, interacting with the medical staff in an excessively friendly manner, and making strange comments. On other occasions, he claimed to be Jesus Christ and exhibited flamboyant behaviors that drew the experts' attention. The defense used these elements to argue that Renato's mental disorders had compromised his ability to fully understand his acts, and therefore he should not be held criminally responsible for what happened. However, for the insanity defense to be accepted, the defense needed to prove something beyond the existence of a mental disorder. It was necessary to prove that the defendant was incapable of distinguishing between right and wrong at the time of the crime. After several months of psychiatric evaluations, experts concluded that Renato was fit to stand trial, paving the way for one of the most notorious and controversial legal proceedings in recent years in the United States, with major repercussions in Portugal. With that, on October 5, 2012, Renato's trial began. From the beginning, the trial attracted huge media attention due to the details about the crime that came to light and the controversy surrounding the defendant's mental state. For many observers, the crucial question was whether the defendant was a criminal fully aware of his acts or someone suffering from a severe psychological disorder. The prosecution began its arguments by meticulously reviewing the defendant's life history. The goal was to show that despite the personality disorders pointed out by experts, Renato was aware of the consequences of his acts and knew exactly what he was doing at the time of the crime. According to the prosecution, the evidence demonstrated that Renato acted consciously before, during, and after the events. As the hearings progressed, public attention intensified. Every testimony, medical report, and expert statement was closely followed by the Portuguese and American press. The trial soon turned into a clash. On one side, the prosecution portrayed the defendant as a man responsible for his decisions, and on the other, the defense maintained that his mental disorders had caused a temporary break with reality. The most shocking moment of the trial occurred when the prosecution presented a reconstruction of Carlos Castro's final hours. Investigators determined that the last time Carlos was seen alive by hotel staff happened on the morning of January 7th, around 10 a.m. At that moment, a housekeeper briefly entered the room and found Carlos reading the newspaper, while Renato was in the bathroom. From that point on, detectives reconstructed the events using the collected evidence and the defendant's own statements during interrogations. According to the version presented by Renato, after coming out of the bathroom, he stated he was deeply distressed because he believed that a strange presence was interfering with his relationship with Carlos. Amidst that situation, Renato received a phone call from his mother coming from Lisbon. The conversation was brief and tense. Carlos intervened to scold Renato for the harsh way he was speaking to his mother, and the confrontation between the two quickly escalated. The accused's mother even heard part of this argument over the phone before Renato refused to continue talking and hung up the phone in her face. From there, what began as a verbal disagreement ended in an extremely violent physical assault. Investigators stated that from this moment on, Renato brutally attacked the victim for a long period. During the trial, Renato claimed that he acted influenced by delusional beliefs related to alleged evil energies. According to the version presented by the defense, he believed that Carlos exerted a negative influence over his life and that he needed to eliminate that which he associated with the victim's masculinity, which allegedly motivated the castration. Renato said he was born to save the world from homosexuality. In fact, the nature of the relationship between the two was one of the most debated points of the case, with striking statements, such as those from his mother, who even gave interviews categorically stating that her son was not gay.
Eu não acredito, porque meu filho, sendo tanto filho de ouro, filho que é muito bom, ele não fazia isso. filho não é namorado do Carlos Castro. O meu filho, ele desde o primeiro tanto instante, ele nunca mas escondeu a sexualidade tanto dele que ele é heterossexual.
The attack was so violent that the jury, the judge, and even those present in the courtroom were deeply shocked by the description of what occurred. The reconstruction also showed that after the assault ended, the defendant's behavior changed drastically. According to the prosecution, Renato demonstrated an apparent control of the situation. He tidied up some items in the room, disabled the suite's communication devices, showered, changed clothes, collected personal belongings, and took over $1,000 from the victim before leaving. These details would later be used by the prosecution to argue that he fully understood the gravity of what occurred. Throughout the reconstruction of the events and during more than 8 weeks of hearings, Renato maintained a posture that caught everyone's attention. He remained seated during presentations, apparently calm and showing no evident emotion in the face of the case's details. This behavior caused strangeness in everyone, from the experts involved in the case to people following the trial from the outside. The defense continued to maintain that Renato was not in normal psychological conditions at the time of the crime, and that his disorders had a direct influence on his actions. Several experts, called by both parties, agreed that Renato presented genuine mental disturbances. However, while the defense argued that these conditions justified an acquittal by reason of insanity, the prosecution insisted that the defendant fully understood the nature of his acts. For several days, the trial turned into an intense debate between experts in forensic psychiatry. At the end of the instructional phase, the prosecution presented its closing arguments. The prosecution reinforced that no personality disorder could justify a crime of that gravity and stated that the studies conducted indicated that Renato still possessed the capacity to understand his acts. They asked the jury to carefully analyze all the evidence and deliver a verdict based on the facts. In turn, the defense presented its closing arguments, describing Renato as a person suffering from severe psychological problems that led him to an episode of mental disturbance. According to their arguments, these circumstances should be considered sufficient to exempt him from criminal responsibility. Finally, on November 30th, 2012, after about 6 hours of deliberation, the jury reached a unanimous decision. The jury concluded that Renato presented psychological disorders, but that they were not sufficient to prevent him from understanding his acts at the time of the crime. Renato Seabra was found guilty of murder. On December 21st, 2012, the judge handed down a sentence of life imprisonment with a minimum of 25 years of incarceration. According to the decision, starting in January 2036, he will become eligible to apply for parole. In the years following his conviction, Renato underwent numerous interviews, medical evaluations, and studies. Throughout all this time, he repeatedly stated that he did not clearly remember what happened on January 7, 2011, although he also declared feeling deep remorse for Carlos's death. Experts who tracked his progress concluded that the diagnosed personality disorders were consistent with his behavior over the years. Thanks to prolonged treatment based on psychiatric supervision and medication, his emotional stability improved significantly. Currently, Renato is serving his sentence in a maximum security prison located in upstate New York, near the border with Canada. The penitentiary is known for housing some of the inmates considered most dangerous in the American prison system, and for the difficulties imposed by its location, marked by extreme cold. For this reason, the facility earned the nickname America's Siberia. The first years behind bars were especially difficult for the former model. During this period, he attempted against his own life twice, which led prison authorities to place him under strict observation and specialized treatment. As the years went by, Renato managed to adapt to the prison routine. Currently, he is considered a disciplined inmate, works in the prison's garment shop, and participates in religious activities and programs aimed at his psychological follow-up. By maintaining this behavior, Renato may receive a more favorable evaluation when the time comes to apply for parole. The situation has also been painful for his parents, Joaquim Seabra and Maria Odilia. Visitation restrictions combined with the high cost of travel between Portugal and the United States made family contact extremely difficult. In an attempt to stay close to her son, Maria Odilia even moved temporarily to a small town near the prison. However, maintaining this situation ultimately proved financially unsustainable, and Maria Odilia returned to Lisbon, from where she tried to visit Renato only a few times a year. Although Renato was convicted for Carlos's death, the debate over the proportionality of the sentence continues to be discussed by experts and human rights advocates. More than a decade later, this remains one of the most shocking cases in recent history between Portugal and the United States. Carlos Castro left behind a trajectory of decades of work in Portuguese journalism. However, everything ended in a tragic and unexpected way in that suite in New York. But what do you think? Do you believe Renato really experienced a psychotic episode, or did he stage everything to try to avoid going to prison? Leave your opinion in the comments. Thanks for watching until the end, and I'll see you in the next video.